On the pitch, Inter Milan are first in the league and flying high.
Inter strike first, and once again, it's Lukaku and Lautaro. Eriksen for Perisic, brilliant. That is the team goal to end all team goals. Because here goes Romelu Lukaku. He's going to streak away here from Valenti. Now he finds Alexis Sanchez, who's Inter's hero on the night, and who sends Inter 6 points clear at the top of the Serie A table.
After 11 years of waiting, Inter are on the verge of winning Serie A. And yet things are far from rosy at the club. In recent months, Inter have been unable to pay player wages, and reports in Italy suggest their owners are looking to sell part or all of the club. Today we ask, why is Suning Group trying to sell Inter Milan?
So Inter are undergoing an on-the-pitch renaissance.
James Corbett is a financial reporter for offthepitch.com.
They are leading Serie A with 11 games to go. Off the pitch, their finances are a basket case. They're losing money because of the lockdown and the fact that they can't bring in crowds into stadiums, but they've invested very, very heavily in their first team squad over the last 2 years, and that has extenuated losses that they were already going to make. The whole situation is now compounded by the fact that their Chinese owners, the Suning Group, are not able to effectively bring capital out of China and put it into to essentially prop them up. The club are behind on player salaries. They were unable to bring in even modest transfer targets in January to sort of supplement their title challenge. And there's a risk that they'll run out of money entirely before the end of the season even.
Before we get to what's kind of causing their current issues, let's look at their owners, the Suning Group, who you just mentioned. Can you give us a little background on them?
So they're a major consumer retailer in China. They started out in, I think, 1990.
In 1990, Suning started its business. By far, with 2 listed companies at home and abroad, Suning has grown into the largest commercial retailer in China, adhering to the mission of leading the industry in creating a higher quality of life for all. Suning centers
just as the company had started opening up, and they hit the crest of the wave as wealth came into China, and suddenly you have an emergent middle class who want all the trappings of Western middle class life, such as TVs, telephones, mobile phones, and so on, and they tapped into that. And it's, over the past 10, 15 years, it's expanded into more general retail, department stores, and so on. But obviously it's been hit very, very hard by the very strict lockdowns that we've had in China, as indeed the rest of the world. People aren't able to go out and do their shopping in the ways that we know. So there's been a shift online, and Alibaba, which is, I suppose, the Chinese Amazon, has been one of the main beneficiaries of that, to the cost of Suning. Alibaba, ironically, actually owned 20% of Suning, but Suning is an old bricks and mortar retailer, I suppose, in a world that's rapidly changing.
So if you happen to have a little bit more than $300 million sitting around and you were wondering what you could get with it, I have one option for you. You could get a roughly 70% stake in one of football's most famous clubs. That, of course, would be Inter Milan. The deal that was announced today here in China sees China's Suning Holdings Group purchasing a 70% or so stake in the club, and really is is a landmark deal for Chinese investment in overseas football.
So how does this brick and mortars retail company become owners of one of the most famous traditional clubs of Italy, Inter Milan?
I must admit, I don't know the exact circumstances of the takeover, but just talking in general terms about Chinese takeovers of football clubs and other leading brands. I mean, I've talked to a number of people about this, and it's almost like a validation of the wealth of these companies and their owners. You know, they bring it into storied Western brands, and you know, there's a great cachet and level of prestige. And you know, let's not forget also that, I mean, football isn't really the biggest sport in China. That would be basketball. But if you are, I mean, it's still pretty big. But if you're looking at a Western brand of football, then Serie A is the leading brand in China on account of the fact that it was broadcast on free-to-air TV throughout the 1990s. So there's an historic following there, and you know, you can only imagine how attractive Inter would have been to any major Chinese business.
They've been the owners of Inter for a little over 3 years. In that time, you know, what have they done with the finances of the club?
So they've invested very, very heavily in the first team squad, and you know, they've bought some leading players. One of the criticisms of Serie A over the years is that it's not like the 1990s anymore. You know, they don't have those world-class players at the top of their game in the way that, you know, they had the Baggios and Batistutas and Maldinis back then. But what Inter have actually done is you know, they've brought some of that back. You know, they've signed Romelu Lukaku, who is, you know, arguably with you know, perhaps behind Lewandowski, but he's arguably in the top three even strikers in Europe at the moment. They bought Christian Eriksen from Tottenham. He was approaching the end of his contract. They bought Alexis Sanchez, whose best days might be behind him, but you know, he seems to be undergoing a renaissance in Italy. So yeah, they've invested very heavily in the first team squad. There's plans to redevelop the San Siro Stadium complex in conjunction with AC Milan, and they've done things off the pitch to help market the club overseas. So there's a digital transformation going on. You know, they're simplifying the brand. So instead of the famous Internazionale name, it's going to be Inter Milan, which I suppose is easier for foreigners to pronounce. You know, they're simplifying the badge in the way that Juventus did 4 or 5 years ago to make it more marketable, and they've been I suppose piggybacking on the Suning brand and infrastructure to market themselves effectively in China. So they have done an awful lot. I profiled them last week, and you know, the Italian press have generally been favourable to what they've done. You know, they're not incompetent owners by any stretch of the imagination, notwithstanding the current crisis that they're facing.
So when did this current financial crisis that they're facing start to take shape?
So Suning own PPTV, which is a paid broadcast service in China, and they own the Premier League's rights. And not long after the pandemic struck, they tried to renegotiate their contract with the Premier League. There's two versions to this story. One is that, you know, they were affronted that the Premier League were giving rebates to other broadcasters domestically because, you know, games are now being played behind closed doors, they were postponed, etc., etc. The other version is that they bet very, very heavily on the Premier League rights and were just losing money hand over fist. Either way, they weren't going to honour their contract, and the Premier League abruptly withdrew. That was in September 2020. I suppose looking back, you see a red flag there. The fact that they're not able to fulfil their contracts, and you wonder what's going on elsewhere within the group. But at the time, it was seen as being a very specific dispute. What's happened since then is that there's been restrictions on capital outflow for non-strategic Chinese investments, and this has impacted very heavily in sport. So essentially, it's very hard to shift money out of China into Western companies that they own, and underlying this is the Chinese government and deference to the Chinese government and its wishes. I mean, if you speak to people in general industry, they're saying that this is impacting all sorts of sectors, including even the energy sector, which, the Chinese have invested in very, very heavily in Britain and France over the last 10 years. So I don't think it's specific to football. But what it's meant is, at the worst possible time when Inter aren't able to generate the money that they ordinarily would do, because they would normally have full stadiums, they're challenging for the title, where they need their finances augmenting, the owners aren't able to do that. So they've been looking at selling a stake in the club, they've been looking at borrowing money on the markets, but, 2 months on, 3 months on, nothing seems to have happened.
And we know that it's not just impacting their Italian club, Inter, but this past week they made a statement regarding their Chinese club, Jiangsu FC, who just won the Chinese Super League for the first time. What happened there?
So yeah, Jiangsu had just won the Super League, and they abruptly said that they're pulling out. Whether it's going to be as harsh as that going forward, I don't really know, but it looks pretty bleak for the club at the moment, with the owners just unilaterally pulling the plug on it.
From the outside, a lot of people might see this as a sale kind of prompted by the effects of the coronavirus pandemic, but it's clear that it kind of is more that meets the eye there.
Yeah, I think so. I think Chinese government's acting in a very specific way to the challenges that are facing its wider economy. And as I said, there's a broader crisis in retail, so it's affected Suning in a very particular and specific way. So whether it's tied into the emerging Cold War between China and the West, I don't really know. I suppose only time will tell.
So what is the latest with their sale? I know they've been talking with several people. Who have they been talking to, and how much are they valuing the club at?
So BC Partners, which is a British private equity group, had a period of exclusivity which expired. I can't remember the date. It was either the first week of February or the last week of January. That expired. There was meant to be a difference of about 150 million euros on the valuation. So Suning valued it at 900, and BC Partners were only prepared to go to 750. Since then, there's been all sorts of talk of other private equity groups from Sweden, from Singapore, looking at buying into the club. I would expect that they might be tempted to just sit it out, and just wait and see what happens, because, from Suning's perspective, they can get more money if they sell the reigning Italian champions, and from a private equity group's perspective, the more desperate that the owners are for cash and the ability to sustain it, the further the price goes down.
So is there any chance that this sale is just a minority stake in the club, or are we expecting that they'll just sell all of their stake in the club?
When BC Partners were looking at the club in January, the reports were that Suning were only looking at selling a 200 million stake in the club, which would effectively have kept it going throughout the rest of the coronavirus. It now looks more likely that they're going to sell the club outright. There have also been reports that they're looking on the markets to borrow 200 million in cash, but whether in the current environment that will, whether that's a realistic prospect, I'm not really sure.
As we look forward, what are the challenges or obstacles they face in selling the club, or even, just keeping it afloat?
I think keeping it afloat may be the biggest challenge, because we've had so many false dawns with the current COVID crisis. There could be a new variant, or there could be a problem with vaccine rollouts that's specific to Italy or Europe in general, and prospects of having crowds in stadiums suddenly goes to 2022-23, and any new owner is going to then be expected to bankroll losses then. So I think it's very difficult for anybody running a football club, and they have to be aware of those risks. Inter's a blue chip brand, and it's in a generally good position on the pitch. Was in a very good position on the pitch, but it's in a decent position off the pitch. They've done a lot of the preparatory work to rebrand it as an attractive force for new supporters elsewhere in the world, that they'll hopefully new owners will be able to monetize that. So I don't think they'll have any problems selling it on, to be perfectly honest. Western brands have never quite succeeded in China, and equally Chinese owners looking for somewhere to put their wealth have never really succeeded in Europe. And it strikes me that Suning is just the latest chapter in this ongoing East-West tale that's gone on for 20 years, where nobody's quite managed to succeed in making an on-the-pitch success and an off-the-pitch success, either in China or Europe.
As Corbett hinted at earlier, this potential sale is part of a larger trend. To learn more about why Chinese investors are pulling out of Europe, I spoke to Simon Chadwick. Chadwick is a professor and director of Eurasian sport at M. Lyon Business School. We just spoke to James Corbett about Suning's desire to sell part or all of Inter Milan. Simon, how would you characterize the last 6 or so years of Chinese investment in European football?
A surge and then a decline. And this is a reflection of, I think, transition from one state plan to another state plan. But it's also the reaction to, I think, China learning more about how to develop, professionalise and commercialise its football.
If we go back to 2014, 15, 16, why did we see so many Chinese investors flocking to Europe?
For several reasons. I think fundamentally this was about President Xi supposedly announcing that he wanted China to win the World Cup. It seems that he didn't actually say that. He wanted China to become a leading FIFA nation, but this was taken as a call to action amongst entrepreneurs, investors, business people and others. What we saw as a consequence of President Xi's announcement was a sudden movement of capital out of the country into investments elsewhere in the world. And this was very consistent with the 5-year plan in place at the time, which emphasised the need from government for investors, businesses, entrepreneurs to engage in outbound investment from China.
In most Western countries, businesses and the government are kind of kept separate and are private. Can you kind of describe the relationship between Chinese businesses and the government?
So there are private businesses in China, but that's private in inverted commas. You're never more than one step away in China from the government, no matter who you are, what you do, or where you are. And for the larger corporations, you'll very often find that the Chinese Communist Party has a branch inside the company, inside the business. And so there is a direct line of communication from inside businesses through to not just regional Communist Party officials, but national Communist Party officials. And so there is this regular flow of information, which ultimately results in even private businesses effectively becoming instruments of the state. In other words, what they're doing is they're enabling state policy.
So by the end of 2017, we saw more than 20 clubs in Europe purchased by Chinese investors. And, some of those examples include AC Milan, Aston Villa, Espanyol, Southampton. I could go on. How many clubs have Chinese owners now as we speak today in 2021?
So overseas ownership of clubs, we're down, I think, at 10 or just below 10 in Europe. And we've seen some fairly dramatic falls from grace Slavia Prague and its ownership by CEFC Energy is one that is particularly striking. The former Chinese owner of Slavia Prague is now in jail for almost 30 years. We've seen Tony Shah at Aston Villa, who came amidst a great deal of noise and hubbub, who has now disappeared from view and apparently is being investigated by state authorities. So they very quickly came and they very quickly disappeared, and it is a dwindling number.
So when did we see that trend start to happen of Chinese investors disappearing from Europe?
This really began in mid-2017 because at that time the Chinese financial system was beginning to overheat and there were concerns about its vulnerability amongst Chinese state officials. What had happened through 2015-16, which were those boom years for Chinese football, is that a lot of European club owners had borrowed money domestically in China, but were then investing their monies overseas, very often in assets that weren't yielding a financial return. And so the very first case of a return home was really Wang Jianlin, the owner of Wanda, and Wanda had a stake in Spain's Atletico Madrid. Wang was called back home. He sold his stake in Atletico. It's now down at, I think, 3%. Upon his return to China, he was detained by the authorities. He went missing for a period of time. Apparently his passport was confiscated. And then he reappeared some months later as the new owner of the Dalian club in the Chinese Super League. And Wang was, kind of back on message and back with the programme. And I think this is very much what we're seeing now with Suning as well, is this call back home, the state really pressing the need for divestment from Inter Milan. And as we already know, I think Suning will focus on Chinese domestic activities. We've seen recently a very interesting video on social media from the company's chief executive talking about the need to focus on what they do best.
第4个10年，苏宁正在卸下包袱，轻装上阵，但同时
So this seems to have been by and large the game plan. Either you return home and focus on China, or you return home and you disappear from a while and help the state in whatever way they want you to help them with.
So just to kind of sum up a little bit, is the idea, from the perspective of the Chinese state, is that they're concerned that money is being made in China and then being spent overseas and therefore kind of making the Chinese economy weaker?
The essence is that a lot of the finance that has driven China's overseas football expansion has been borrowed by domestic investors from domestic institutions, but then invested overseas. So instead of retaining wealth in China, it has been distributed elsewhere in the world. I think it's worth mentioning too that there are some in China who view what has been happening as money laundering. And certainly there are one or two European clubs who are owned by people who some in China believe are actually money launderers. They've moved their assets offshore and they're laundering what they have. Laundering, again, is very much in inverted commas because I think it's a label rather than laundering in the sense that many Westerners might know it. But essentially what football is a loss-making industry. It doesn't make huge profits. And so you've effectively got this, you've had this leakage of finance, this leakage of liquidity from the Chinese financial system, not just into football, but into other industrial sectors as well, where the returns simply haven't justified the outbound investment that these businesses have been engaged in.
You mentioned how this is like one of the driving factors why Suning might be coming back to China. How nervous should Wolves fans be that Fosun might sell part or all of the club?
Now, if you look at Fosun, I think Fosun on that basis, Fosun, there are some similarities with Suning, but I also think there are some significant differences. I think in Fosun's case, this again is a company that financially has been in something of a precarious state in recent times. It's only within the last 2 weeks that Fosun's Moody's rating has improved from unstable to stable. But certainly over the last 12 months, especially during the period of the pandemic, I've been watching Fosun very, very carefully, because in my view, it has not been inconceivable that potentially Fosun may be exposed to the same kind of pressure as we've seen at Suning, as we've seen at Wanda and Atletico Madrid and other corporations too. However, I think Fosun, number one, has been strategically important to China over the last 12 months. So Fosun has been instrumental in assisting the Chinese government to roll out China's COVID vaccination program. So as a consequence of this, the corporation has been able to build up political capital in a way that Suning never did. So in spite of Fosun's financial position, I think it's rather less vulnerable than Suning. The other thing you've got to keep in mind about Fosun is clearly Fosun owns Wolverhampton Wanderers. Wolverhampton Wanderers is a Premier League football club. As a consequence of that, officials from Wolverhampton will be sitting in important Premier League meetings. And one of the things they will be doing is they will be party to discussions on the next round of TV rights negotiations in China. So if you recall, if your listeners recall, last summer, Liverpool's final home game of the season when they were crowned champions at Anfield, this match was actually demoted on Chinese TV. And what we've seen over the last 6 months, 7 months, not just in England, but in France and in Spain too, is Chinese broadcasters under the influence of the Chinese government really trying to drive down rights values and adopt a much more bullish, aggressive position in rights negotiations. So I think certainly in the short to medium term, Fosun will be serving a very important role through its ownership of Wolves in helping to inform Chinese government and Chinese broadcasters about the current state of play, the current thinking inside the Premier League when it comes to those TV rights.
So we should expect TV rights in China for the Premier League to go down in the next contract.
Well, as we know, the existing deal that was in place, Tencent, one of China's biggest digital corporations, took that contract over at the start of the season. So the contract is only going to last for a year. And I'm not about to make any dramatic claims that contracts will be worth considerably less than they used to be. And I'm definitely not going to say China's not going to see Premier League TV on its screens anytime soon. But what I do think will happen is that from the Chinese side, the negotiations in those rights discussions will be much, much more aggressive than we've seen in the past.
Now, a lot of what we are talking about was put into writing in their most recent 5-year plan, which was announced in 2020. What did that plan say?
So for listeners who are unfamiliar, I hesitate to call China a communist country. I know that the Chinese don't like to be called a communist country. And certainly when you look at these big companies that seem to many of us to be operating in the same way as companies operate across the world, this doesn't look like communism either. So let's just call it a peculiar form of state-led capitalism is another way to put this. But you can be absolutely certain that the heavy hand of the state dictates everything inside China. And so the 5-year plans, which are the residue of communism in China, essentially define and dictate what is going to happen in the country economically, industrially, politically, to a certain extent socioculturally as well over the next 5 years. So we're currently in the midst of a transition from the 13th plan to the 14th plan. What we now got with the new plan is a switch, and inbound investment is being encouraged. And so the likely return home of Suning is very much consistent with that call for inbound investment. But I also think what is happening in Chinese football is a further reflection of this change in emphasis of the new 5-year plan. So, for instance, we know that over the last 3 or 4 months, Chinese football clubs, Chinese Super League clubs, have been instructed to remove company names from their names. So, Jiangsu Suning, for example, became Jiangsu FC, and as we know, Jiangsu FC is no more. But the likes of Shanghai SIPG has now become Shanghai Port City, and so on and so forth. At the same time, what appears to be happening is the names of those businesses, the names of those companies will disappear from the shirts of these clubs. So if we take Jiangsu Suning, for example, it always played with the Suning name on its shirt. So my view of this is this is all part of a move to encourage inward investment, inbound investment. Because if you take a city like Shanghai, for example, Shanghai is a population of about 24 million people. And for companies like Chevrolet or Emirates Airlines or one of these other brands with which we're familiar with in football and shirt sponsorships, I think what we will see is those kind of megabucks deals that we've seen across European football and shirt sponsorship deals beginning to appear in China, because it's the intention of the Chinese FA and of Chinese government to draw in that kind of inbound investment, that kind of revenue.
So is the idea to take essentially all that external money and pump it into the domestic league and make the Chinese Super League a lot more, profitable and much bigger?
So I hesitate to say this, but I'm going to say it anyways. Is whilst in the West we had Donald Trump peddling, make America great again, we've also had President Xi in China peddling a similar line, which is make China great again. And I think there has been a realization in Chinese government, and for that matter in Chinese football circles, that you don't make China great again by investing in Aston Villa. You don't make China great again by paying Carlos Tevez $660,000 a week to go play in Shanghai. So what has definitely happened from mid-2017 onwards, but is crystallizing much more now, is a feeling in China that the long-term path to the success and prosperity of Chinese football is via internal investment by Chinese investors in China, but also through attracting investments from elsewhere in the world. And just as we've seen Manchester City being bought by Abu Dhabi, we've seen Paris Saint-Germain being bought by Qatar, Chelsea being bought by a Russian, etc., etc., etc. My feeling is that the Chinese government is looking towards similar type investments, be they coming from the Gulf, from individuals like Abramovich, possibly even from US private equity investors. But essentially what this does is it invests into China rather than out of China.
James Corbett is a financial reporter for offthepitch.com. Simon Chadwick is a professor and director of Eurasian Sport at M. Lyon Business School. The music for this episode was provided under the Creative Commons license by Blue Dot Sessions, and you can find more information about those songs in the episode show notes. This episode was produced by myself and John McKenzie. I'm Josh Nader-Weiler. Thanks for listening to Football Today.